60 years after Mikhail Romanov had established a new dynasty that would rule Russia for 300, and stabilized the country for 32 years in his own reign, a new ruler was to come that would overshadow him. The time of troubles was over, but Russia was still backwards, categorically far behind the powers of Europe, still stuck in a feudal medieval period that even the great Tsar Alexei Mikhailovich, the second Romanov, could not do away with. In fact, he probably worsened it by making serfdom the law of the land, binding the peasantry to their nobles for centuries to come. It would be Alexei's son, the giant, literally and figuratively, Peter the Great, the greatest ruler in Russian history, who would change everything with his birth in 1672. Although he was the beloved son of Alexei's second wife, he was not the firstborn, and when Alexei died in 1676, Theodor took the throne. Theodor was effective, although extraordinarily weak and ill, and died after 6 years. This set off a power struggle between Peter's side of the family, who led an insurrection which was crushed by the conservative reactionary guard, the Streltsy, who had been the most militant and forceful Russian elite troops for the last century, who answered to Peter's half-family, especially his half-sister Sophia, who established herself as regent in 1682, with the presumptive heir to Theodor, Ivan V, becoming Tsar along with Peter, who was just a 10-year-old boy. But Sophia would call the shots, running the government rather effectively, but seizing more and more power as her ambition was certainly unbridled. However, she had underestimated her half-brother's ambition, an ambition that would change Russia and the world. In 1689, fully grown, fully educated, in love with the West, and at 6'7", Peter felt strong enough to overthrow Sophia and end the regency, with even the nobles in the Streltsy opting to allow Peter to co-rule with his brother Ivan, who would die in 1695, leaving Peter as the master of Muscovy. The Tsar did everything in his power to upend the power of the boyars, the conservative nobility, the church, and the Streltsy, who had murdered his family. Their revolt was put down with such shocking force that Peter himself administered many of their executions. Peter was a hands-on and effective task manager, and often traveled to the West, especially in the Grand Embassy of 1696 and 1697, in which he traveled to Western countries and learned their style, particularly from the Dutch, who taught him much about anatomy, science, and shipbuilding. The British shared their interest in trade and commercial success, as well as parliament, and while Peter rejected a parliament, he did not reject the idea of dismantling the power of the nobility, their close ties to the church, and corruption in all forms of government. He brought in Western fashion and medicine, new ideas, new schools of thought, new academies, and new places for learning. He even imposed a beard tax and personally barbered for nobles who he believed should adopt European fashion and European dress. Everything was on the table for reform, and although there was much kicking and screaming, this would turn Russia into a European country, a European power at the beginning of the 18th century. The reform of the military would be the most prodigious part of this. Peter's continual campaigns against the Ottomans dealt moderate success as the Ottomans were starting their decline. However, his greatest success would come with the Great Northern War. As Peter installed Russian and European forms of military drilling and new sorts of military tacticians and generals, he also created the Russian Navy in an effort to undermine the Swedish and their control on the Baltic Sea. After early defeats, he eventually built a new fort, a new capital, his window on the west, a European city in the heart of Russia, St. Petersburg. Named after him, with a very German name, it would tie Russia forever to the west, becoming one of the most beautiful cities in all of the world. Eventually, when the Swedish got wind of this, the Great Northern War resumed, with Charles XII marching his forces into Ukraine and being soundly defeated at the Battle of Poltava in 1709. The Swedish were broken. 12 years later, they would sue for peace, and Peter the Great would establish Russia as the master of the Baltic and the most powerful entity in Eastern Europe. The Polish and the Swedish were in retreat. The Russians were on the rise. And to celebrate his victory with the Swedish and an armistice with the Turks, as well as his beautiful new capital and summer palace, Peter established the Russian Empire in 1721, changing the regalia and even the crown of Russia to suit him more perfectly, changing the Tsardom into an empire. However, Peter was not beloved by all. Many nobles resisted him, including his own son Alexei. And while Peter did find the right life companion who would become his successor in his wife Catherine, Alexei constantly disappointed to him, and when he defected, trying to help the Swedish and perhaps other entities fight against Peter and his reforms, Peter made sure to make an example of him to the nobles. He had him tortured, perhaps personally overseeing it, and Alexei died of his wounds. Peter's reforms were dead serious. They were set on bringing Russia into the modern world, and no counter-reform was possible. It had changed Russian culture, society, architecture, art, navy, and everything, and it had cost many, many lives, including Peter's own son. Peter lived and worked hard. He partied and enjoyed his fun, having 15 children from 2 different wives. Peter's remaking of Russia, his great work ethic, his reforms, and his larger-than-life personality, both physically and mentally, were not enough to save him from mortality. After trying to save floundering sailors in the Baltic, he grew ill in the winter of 1724 and 25 and died in February without naming an heir, creating a succession crisis that would eventually result in the rise of his daughter in 1741, and eventually Catherine the Great, his equal in almost every manner, in 1762. Despite the fact that Peter had come to power by unseating a woman he did not believe worthy to rule, for the next 71 years after his death, Russia would be ruled almost exclusively by strong and powerful female rulers. However, as Russia became ever the more dominant throughout the 18th century, growing closer to Europe and going from being a European modernized state and power like Peter had achieved to being a world power like Catherine the Great would achieve, it is doubtful that Peter would have objected to these changes.